Okay, welcome everybody to our third and last but not least virtual job market workshop. We're very excited to have so many of you here right in the midst of the job market. I'm sure by now you have put in a lot of time submitting applications and you're now waiting to hear back about interviews, which are right around the corner. And depending on which markets you are targeting, some of you may already have had flyouts or even offers. That's okay if you haven't. Most of you probably haven't, but the flyouts and offers are right around the corner. And today's workshop will focus on how to prepare for these stages of the job market, starting with flyouts. So in this session, we're happy to have Anne Fitzpatrick, Associate Professor from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, John Voorhees, Principal Economist from the US Census Bureau, John Iyer, Principal Economist and Data Scientist from HP, and JB Doyle, Principal from Cornerstone Research. Here's how this session will work. First, each of our speakers will take about 15 minutes presenting their thoughts. Then we'll have up to 45 minutes for questions and answers. So please prepare your questions, and I will be the one moderating the Q&A. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Anne.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm hoping I made a few slides here. So let me just share my screen. I always have an issue with my monitor. So let me just do this. And then please confirm that you can see what I'm seeing. Can you see what I'm seeing?
Yes.
Yep.
It's not in slideshow mode.
There you go.
Now it's in slideshow mode.
Perfect. All right. Thanks. So basically, I went to Michigan and I graduated in 2015. My fields are development, and I specialize in doing field experiments, and a lot of them revolve around health. I have more recent work in education, but around the time of my job talks, I was mostly focused on health. I've had several flyouts at different types of institutions. I want to caution, I personally have never had a flyout at a liberal arts college or a private sector, a think tank, but those latter are going to be covered later in the workshop. I also have had an interview for a visiting position at a very high-ranked institution for a teaching position. So I can this advice is sort of a hodgepodge of those different types of experiences that I've had. And to protect confidentiality of my friends, I have debriefed extensively with flyouts with my friends, and my sister's actually an economist as well. So what I'm telling you here is a mix of many different people's experience and also on the hiring side. Feel free to ask any questions you want. I'm an open book. So what I'm going to go over here is just basically my impressions. I'm not saying this is the right impression, but this is kind of what I think. So these are generally what we're going to talk about. So the main thing to think about, especially at smaller schools. So if you are probably going to get flyouts outside the top 20 or so econ departments, I think this is the way to think about it. All right, so let's do some backward induction. Okay, so this isn't the way Michigan operates, but it's definitely the way UMass Boston does. So based upon what happens at the first round interviews at ASSA virtually now, schools are going to invite 3 people. Okay, this is a pretty time intensive process. We have to create a list. It needs to be approved by HR and the dean. And we invite people for flyouts based upon this. Okay. UMass Boston, this takes a little bit of time. It can take several days to, if things are functioning well. But keep in mind, I actually got my very first flyout invite during ASSA. So my invite was for the next week, right after my first round interview. So that's sort of the variance that you should be thinking about when you have, you're planning your timeline. You can be asked to go somewhere the following week, or it may be 2 months later. And schools are basically allowed to invite 3 people. Okay, that's for budget reasons and for HR reasons, and because there's a lot of moving parts involved. So if you get a flyout, that means you are a very, very serious contender, because one of these people must take the job. At a school like UMass Boston, it is a very, very, very bad outcome that we end up hiring nobody. Okay, so hopefully if you get a fly out, that should give you some comfort. Okay, it's like the analogy that, if you're in the woods and you're being attacked by a bear, you don't have to be faster than the bear, you have to be faster than your slowest friend. And this is the same situation, right? So hopefully that gives you a lot of confidence that if you get any fly out, then people like your work and think that you could be a good fit. Okay. If none of the people that we fly out will work, it's generally too late. We would risk losing a tenure line because of that. We would try to fly out people later, but the dean would be annoyed with us and it probably won't work. And a failed search is a really, really, really bad outcome for us. Okay. So the main thing to think about, especially, because people tend to go on the market many times in their career, is I think the only rule is don't accept a flyout if you have a strictly dominated offer. Okay. If you have a strictly dominated flyout, that's very different than having an offer. Okay. So the first thing to cover is what to wear. Okay. The first advice is definitely be yourself. Okay. Definitely be yourself. But if you think about the analogy like a first date, right? You may not want to be your whole self. Okay. So you want to be true to who you are, right? I would never advise somebody to fake who they are for an interview, but you may want to make sure that you are, for example, dressed appropriately for a given job. And I'm going to go over the typical schedule next. But in general, you're probably going to want 2 interview appropriate outfits. For men or people who wear suits, including women, for suit and tie, Eric Oren has a nice Twitter thread on how to properly wear a suit for men. There was a situation where a candidate at a flyout did not wear a tie. And that was not received well by one very vocal person. Okay, so I'm not saying that people are not going to judge you by your research, right? People are obviously going to care about you as a person and a researcher, but not dressing appropriately sends a signal that some people interpret negatively. Dresses are totally fine for women. Just to be strategic, I would pick either black or navy or brown for both suit and shoes. Okay. Do not put yourself in a situation where you wear a navy blazer and a black pair of pants. Okay. And how important dress is depends upon the job. At a place like a business school, the way you dress, I think, would matter a lot more than a more liberal environment. So just to flag that, I think it's also common at business schools that people get their clothes tailored. That's not the way my job works. All right, we're lucky if people, don't wear jeans, but some jobs you are expected to dress as a professional. I want to also flag wardrobe malfunction alerts from the horror stories that spread around that have happened that I know about. Okay. For people that, I'll just say it, for women, if you are wearing a shirt as a shell under a suit, please make sure when you lean over and take a note that nobody sees something that they shouldn't. All right. Keep in mind that in a flyout, you may be physically lower than the audience, especially in a stadium seating environment. And therefore, you probably want to double check with a friend to make sure that if you lean over, that nothing bad happens. All right. Similarly, you want to probably check lighting to make sure that nothing is see-through. Okay. And then that's all I want to say about that. I think you can imagine the situations that I'm referring to. Hopefully that speaks for itself. For shoes, especially for women, every flyout I've done involves a ton of walking, a ton. You are walking. I actually had a Fitbit, and you're typically getting like 15,000 steps a day. Okay, so this is a very arduous, exercise process. And keep in mind that if you are applying at snowy weather places, your feet will be cold if you do not wear appropriate shoes. So therefore, I would strongly advise against high heels unless you're one of those people that just rocks high heels. And I just want to also flag that you might also want to think about purchasing clothes for conferences, and the unofficial academic shoe uniform for women is Rothy's. Just putting that out there. So a typical schedule looks like this. Especially in areas that are more difficult to get to, your flyout may be like longer in duration. What can happen is you can have dinner the night before, hence the need for 2 outfits. The other need for 2 outfits is if you have flyouts back to back, and so you don't have time to get your outfit cleaned. Almost always it starts with breakfast the day of, and then you're gonna meet with the entire department in a series of typically 30-minute meetings. If you are in a Zoom flyout, it does look different. When UMass Boston Zoom flyouts, we made it shorter and we doubled up. But you should prepare to be talking with people for the whole day. Usually, if campus is in session, you're gonna do lunch with undergrad or grad students. UMass Boston usually has to do their flyouts when school isn't in session, so that's not an option. But at most schools, the flyouts are during the semester. Some schools offer you meetings with non-tenure track faculty, and sometimes they don't. And that also kind of indicates, I think, something about the culture of the department that you can take note of. You're then also usually going to meet with the dean and possibly the provost. The dean is the person at a university who oversees all of the different chairs of the different departments within the college. The provost is his boss, okay? The meeting with the dean and provost varies by importance by university. At some places, the dean meeting is just a courtesy, just so they say, hey, nice to meet you. At some places, this meeting has a lot of importance, and I know of at least one instance where the department voted somebody for a job and the dean overrode them and said no. So this is definitely an interview or a meeting, a 30-minute meeting to take seriously and prepare for. Sometime during the course of the day, you're going to have a full 1.5, sometimes 1 hour job talk, okay? Usually get some time to prepare yourself before. Teaching schools may ask you to do a teaching demo, and if that's the case, they're typically going to tell you exactly what they want you to see. So at my interview that I was given, they told me to prepare because it was an econometrics position, that's what I teach. They told me to prepare a teaching presentation on the Gauss-Markov theorem and in matrix notation. Then almost always you're going to do dinner that night. And then sometimes they also offer a tour of area and the neighborhoods. This is especially in places where they think people don't want to live. Okay, so they're going to show you some areas and things where where people live and show you that it's nice and safe and things like this. Okay. So what happens after? Basically, after your flyout, all you can really do is say thank you cards or emails. Okay, I personally don't care about this, and people vary in this, but some people really care about it. Then your next job is to just try not to ruminate. Okay, try not to relive every interaction in your mind. You got to move on. Then the work comes from the department side. After the last flyout, the faculty have a meeting, and there's typically 2 rounds of discussion. The first is, who do we think is below the bar? Then among the people who are above the bar, what's our relative ranking? Then the faculty either work to consensus or there's an outright vote. Note that every person in the department does not have equal power, and that's not necessarily correlated with rank, but often is. Then the information is conveyed to the dean who approves, and then an offer goes out to the top person, and then they work their way down if that first person says no. Okay. So how to prepare? The first thing I think about is what you want to know. It's okay to write down questions in advance. What you probably want to know about is details about the tenure process. The tenure process can vary substantially in ways you can't even imagine across universities, ranging from at Harvard Business School, for example, it's guaranteed that not everybody eligible for tenure or qualified for tenure will make it, to UMass Boston, where we have a lot more control over who our letter writers are, and the standards for tenure. You also probably want to know about the course load, the teaching support, where people physically live in the neighborhood that affects housing costs and how far your salary will go, and things about the student body, whether or not the faculty are unionized, and opportunities for conferences. At a job like UMass Boston, I'd be careful about raising questions that may be red flags, okay? If you ask a question about how do I get out of teaching by, how much does it cost to get a teaching course load release, that may be seen as somebody who will not fit in. It's okay to ask the same question to multiple people. And just keep in mind information about salary. Many faculty won't know, and public university salary, you can just look up for anybody. I would advise you to look up the faculty ahead of time, but keep in mind, you will probably not have enough time to get your schedule and then look up who you're meeting with. That's typically not the timeline that happens. But you can look up whether or not the department has a master's or PhD program, what the student body is like, what the department mission is, and things like that. Job talk. Job talks, in my mind, the most stressful job talk I've ever had was at my home institution. And that was something I hope to never happen again. Okay. So basically, you can't read much into engagements and lack thereof. The least engaged audience I have ever had, I got an offer from, and the most engaged audience I've ever had, I also got an offer from. So you cannot read anything into what's happening. Okay. You want to tweak your talk for different audiences. Okay. It's not like you have one talk and then you're set. Okay. At a small department, they are hiring you because they don't have anybody that does what you're doing. So for me, for my offer for UMass Boston, they were looking for somebody that did health because they wanted to replace the line for health, and that was their approval from the dean to apply for a health job. So they didn't have anybody that did anything what I was doing. So I had to make sure and go over experimental design and why you need a control group, okay? At large departments, you have to include more specifics. There's typically people in the audience that know your topic better than you do. So you need to prepare for that sort of environment as well. Often for jobs, there can be hidden requirements. So for one of our more recent searches, we wanted somebody who could teach econometrics, but the official line was approved for gender. So we wanted somebody that had the intersection of the two. So therefore, because I teach econometrics, I made sure that everybody up there was qualified in my mind to teach econometrics. So don't put anything in your job talk that you cannot articulate and explain. So one person, for example, in their job talk that didn't get the offer, didn't know the two conditions for IV, or rather articulated them incorrectly. To me, that's a no-go. What I don't like is people playing videos. I don't like people going over time, and I don't know people adjusting their talk to adjust on the fly. And obviously a presentation that's not visually appealing. What I do like is people telling a little bit about themselves in the beginning and tell us a little bit at the end about what's planned, and be visual if possible. So for example, if you're trying to talk about impacts of test scores, this I think is much more appealing than just doing a screenshot from your paper that still even has table 5 at the top. I would not suggest doing this. It's not like it's bad, it's just not as effective. Other common situations. My husband is a math professor. And so from when I was on the market, having to solve the two-body problem was like a big deal. And I feel like I may have handled that incorrectly in retrospect. And whether or not, if, for example, if you are homosexual, this may be a very personal choice about whether to reveal your partner and their job. But keep in mind that in basically many positions that I've been involved with, it is very, very difficult for universities to make offers across colleges for partners. Within a college, especially if the partner is willing to take an NTT, that seems to be very much more doable. But also keep in mind that in a place like Boston, in a major city, the response from UMass Boston when I asked for a job for my partner was, "This is Boston, he'll find something." Okay. But just, it's a very personal choice, and there's not a right answer about how to proceed. I want to address people that are minorities or other groups that may face discrimination. For example, if you're pregnant, is one example as well. And I think the way that discrimination often manifests within the faculty discussion is, I don't think they're gonna like it here. So the only way I can think about to combat that is to just make sure that if it is a job that you want, to make sure that that line of discussion is shut down immediately. Notice in the US, it is not allowed to ask questions about things that may be discriminatory, such as your marital status, whether or not you plan to have kids. If you're pregnant, then obviously that's out the window. But keep in mind that I think a lot of times illegal questions come from people who are searching for topics. But the way to address that, I think, is to just say, I think what you're getting at is blah, and I can assure you that I am very dedicated to my research, and here's examples of my pipeline, things like that. The final thing I want to talk about is that not getting a job or flyout typically reflects nothing against you. If you do not get a job, if you do not get a flyout from a given university, that typically means nothing, okay? Oftentimes it happens by idiosyncratic things that are happening behind the scenes that have nothing to do with you, okay? People are looking to distinguish all people that by definition that you got a flyout are very, very good. And the rule of 3 is typically in effect, where basically for every 3 flyouts, you can expect to get 1 job. And that's what I would say to lower the stress. In general, you are already good enough, full stop. If you get a flyout, then that means that the department thinks you may also be a good fit. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Anne. Next up, we'll have John Voorhees from the U.S. Census Bureau.
Okay, awesome. I don't have slides, so Anne, you probably want to stop sharing your screen. Awesome. So
Great.
I'm just going to talk. I have some notes. You get to look at my face instead of slides. Hopefully everyone's okay with that. The other thing, I noted this to Tatiana, but I have been having intermittent internet issues. So if I freeze and it looks like I'm not coming back, then just go to the next speaker and we'll get whatever I have to say after that. Okay, so I'm John Voorhees. I'm a principal economist at the U.S. Census Bureau in the Center for Economic Studies, which is one of the main areas at Census that sort of has critical mass of economists. So I finished my PhD in 2016, a little bit after Anne. And I've been at Census for about 6.5 years at this point. So I'm currently in a principal economist role, which is sort of a senior technical position. But before I moved into my current role, I was either a direct supervisor that had a vacancy to fill, or I was leading recruiting efforts for CES for the 2019, 2020, and 2021 job markets. So I've been involved on the hiring side for quite a lot of searches from Census. So in those 3 markets, we hired, I think, at least 6 or 7 people. So I'm much more familiar now at this point on the hiring side of the market. I obviously also went through the flyout process at Census back in 2016. That feels like forever ago, but I can shade a little bit of my own personal experience. So I actually think Anne's overview was actually quite good. I'm glad I'm going after her. Most of the sort of structure of how flyouts work for a government job are very similar to the academic experience. So the sort of day schedule will look quite similar. You'll be meeting with folks for sort of half-an-hour meetings. Instead of meeting the dean, you will be meeting with probably the sort of center chief, division chief, or sort of other relevant title for the sort of area that's hiring. That's often going to be sort of an SES executive in the bureau. You probably will not meet with the director of the Census Bureau, for instance, but you'd be meeting with sort of your immediate area's supervisor. So yeah, so I'll sort of fill in some things that I think are unique to the government flyout experience, and I think some suggestions for how to get the most out of a flyout with a government agency, and sort of what I think are probably some tactics for success. I guess before I launch into that, I should actually maybe note just some level setting about what government jobs are for economists. There's a lot of economists in government, I think thousands of economists at this point. And there's a lot of variation across the different sort of jobs that economists might do in government. But I think there's sort of two key groups of economists in the government. There's economists who work for statistical agencies like Census or the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where the tasks that you're sort of doing are much more about basic economic measurement, and then thinking about using that basic economic measurement for sort of academic style research. And then there's a second group of economists who are in regulatory agencies, so like the EPA or the Federal Trade Commission, where a lot of your sort of work is much more focused on supporting regulatory actions that the agency is engaged in. And then there's sort of the third group, which is all the economists at the Fed board and the Federal Reserve banks, who are sort of a combination of both, right? So the Federal Reserve is both a regulatory agency and a statistical agency. And so depending on where you are in the Fed, your job can look more like a job at BEA, or it can look more like a job at EPA or FHFA, for instance. Okay, so let me maybe note a couple things about what you might expect in a government flyout and how that might be a little bit different from what we heard from Anne. So first, I'll say that I think a lot, maybe a majority of agencies at this point, I think, are planning on doing
Okay, so we have some freezing issues. Jonathan, maybe if you don't mind talking now, and then we'll come back to John a little bit later.
Yeah, let me get myself into a better position. Sure. So as I'm pulling myself together, so my name is Jonathan Iyer. I'm a principal economist / data scientist at HP Inc. Oh, John's
so
back.
I'm actually back. So
Okay.
do you want me to continue on with what I'm doing? So
Okay, yeah. If you think it'll hold up, let's try that.
okay, I will try to get my main points out, and then sorry about the inconvenience. Okay, so some agencies are still going to be doing virtual flyouts, is I think the last thing that I was trying to say before my internet disconnected. The other sort of chief structural difference between government flyouts and the academic flyouts that Anne described has to do with the sort of meals and interaction before and after the main sort of 9 to 5 flyout day. Often government agencies sort of have ethics rules or budget rules that sort of prevent them from being able to do extra meals outside of the workday. And so often you'll sort of like just have to show up at 8 o'clock in the morning at the agency and start your day, and then you'll leave at 5 o'clock in the evening. So be prepared for that to be a little bit different from academic flyouts. And that means, especially if you're at an agency in DC, you're going to have to sort of potentially navigate how to get from your hotel to the agency. So give yourself a little bit of extra time in the morning. The other thing that I think is really crucial for government flyouts that is likely to be a little bit different than academic jobs is that you're going to probably get some instruction either in the sort of call that sort of invites you to the flyout or on the flyout that day on how to navigate some particular aspects of the federal HR process. So oftentimes federal agencies have to work through USA Jobs and other sort of government-wide bureaucracies. These can be very difficult to navigate. If your hiring manager is good at their job, they're going to give you very detailed instructions on how exactly you should navigate that. You really want to pay attention to those instructions and follow them. Take notes if you need to. Okay. I think Anne's advice sort of very, very broadly holds up. I did want to say a couple things about what specifically you can get out of a flyout at a government for a government agency that I think are particularly useful. And the chief thing that I think is useful to get out of a flyout, coming straight out of a PhD program, is to try and get a sense for what the day-to-day work actually looks like for the economists in the area that you're talking to. So you're broadly familiar with research because you've written a sort of dissertation. You're probably pretty familiar with teaching, either as a teaching assistant or as a solo teacher. But the one thing that I think the most PhD programs don't necessarily prepare you for is the sort of body of work that a lot of government economists end up doing. This work sometimes gets called policy work or service work. This is work that's sort of like directed from sort of agency leadership, that's sort of about meeting the goals of the agency. This can vary a lot from agency to agency, and this is something that you really should get a handle on whether you're going to enjoy that type of work. So this is, I think, a key chance to really understand the type of work that the economists are actually doing. So this can vary a lot. So I noted that there's this difference between statistical agencies and regulatory agencies. So you could sort of think about sort of economists at BLS might be supporting the Consumer Expenditure Survey. Economists at Census often will be supporting the Econ Census or building sort of data infrastructure products or the American Community Survey. Whereas economists at the Fed board are often going to be tasked with supporting sort of forecasting or sort of other exercises for the members of the Federal Reserve Board. And economists at regulatory agencies like the EPA are often tasked with doing sort of regulatory analysis in support of some regulatory action that's happening, or often sort of regular reports that sort of are mandated by Congress or other executive actions. So getting a handle on that, I think, is a key thing, and that's actually quite important. The other sort of thing that's less clear, I think, to economists who are coming straight out of a PhD, that is something that you can get a handle on, is what career progression looks like in that particular agency. So there's many different ways that government agencies handle trying to promote people. Some agencies will have sort of a ladder where you can sort of start at GS12 somewhere on the general schedule and sort of have predictable upward mobility. Other agencies sort of don't have this ladder system, so you need to sort of compete for jobs at higher pay scales. And understanding that and who's been successful, sort of if it seems like there is possibility of upward mobility, is, I think, a key thing that you can sort of get out of the flyout. And then the other sort of thing that I think is useful to get a handle on is what research that's not directed from leadership seems to be well supported at the agency. This is, I think, the biggest thing that separates sort of a good government job from a less good government job. Particularly if you're sort of interested in sort of maintaining a research agenda that sort of is related to, but maybe not exactly sort of overlapping with the mission of the agency that you're talking to. Getting a sense for sort of what research seems to be supported is very important, and sort of that's going to be important information for whether you think that you might want to sort of pursue that job. Okay, so finally, I just wanted to note a couple of things that I think are quite useful, or that I have found useful as a hiring manager that people have done. that I think can make for a successful flyout. So one is to do a little bit of homework. I think this definitely applies to academic flyouts and to private sector flyouts as well. But sort of looking up the people who are on your schedule and sort of thinking about what their research looks like is particularly important in government jobs. There's, I think, a little bit more sort of collaboration and sort of teamwork that happens inside government versus academic positions, where you will often have co-authors, but they aren't necessarily going to be in your same department. In sort of the many agencies, because a lot of the service work like has sort of a teamwork component, there's a large team working on sort of, you know, different service work tasks that might need to happen. Sort of understanding who you could see yourself collaborating with is particularly important, and sort of having done the homework to sort of think about how you might fit in the group is, I think, useful for the hiring manager. The other thing I'll say is, I mean, and this applies to everyone, like, just don't be a jerk. That's like the huge thing. And also, like, just be upfront and honest about your preferences. I understand that many people are not looking for government jobs as their first option, and that's fine. I wasn't, when I was on the market, thinking about government jobs as my first option. But understanding sort of where you are is very important for the people that you're talking to, in terms of how they can either sort of, you know, give you more information that might change your priors, or sort of how they might structure their offers in terms of who they need to hire. Much like Anne, a lot of government agencies have funding constraints, and striking out on the market is quite a bad outcome. So that's that. So I think that's actually most of my rambling thoughts. So I can turn it back over to Jonathan. And thank you for bearing with my technical difficulties.
Thanks so much, John. And Jonathan, thanks for stepping up. And now it's the real thing. You're up.
Okay, great. It was practice. So as I was saying, my name is Jonathan Iyer. I'm a principal economist / data scientist at HP Inc., which you might recognize. You might recognize the name Hewlett Packard. HP Inc. is kind of the computers and printers portion after they spun off about 10 years ago. So I do have, because I'm in the private sector, this is called a deck and not slides. But let me share my deck. So what I'm going to want to talk to you about is kind of the overall structure of, you know, in academia or government, you know, we call them the flyouts. Private sector is going to generally refer to them as on-sites. And so these are going to be pretty different structurally from what happens in academia in particular. I'm going to say most of this is derived from my experience across not only my job at HP, where I've been obviously on the interviewing side, but also, you know, other private sector jobs that I've interviewed for. By and large, these are tech jobs. So I'll do my best to kind of temper and point out where, you know, things would be different if you were going to, you know, a non-tech company, right? Tech companies have a reputation, right, of being a little bit more casual. So there's things where you might want to kind of revise your strategy if you're interviewing at, you know, an investment bank or something like that. So just to kind of couch you in the discussion. So the overall pipeline, right, in tech hiring, private sector hiring is kind of different than what's happening in academia, right? Except for maybe the big players like Google and Amazon. You know, you're not going to have kind of first round ASSA interviews. You go through the general kind of HR screening process. We will typically refer to, you know, the flyout stage as the on-site. So this is the, you know, much like in academia, this is the kind of last step before the hiring process, and you have to get through a lot of other stuff. And the on-site is going to be a mix of, you know, technical and behavioral and potentially presentation style interviews. The one thing that I'll say about the phrase on-site, this is kind of an anachronism. So I did do some interviewing in the tech sector prior to COVID, and when those happened, these were in fact on-sites, right? You fly to San Francisco, or wherever the relevant place is, and you take your it's a day, much like the flyouts in academia that folks were talking about. Since COVID, these have pivoted to be online. The difference is I don't see that going away. By and large, people in the private sector are quite happy with the with having the kind of Zoom on-site experience. It's unfortunate to some degree because you do miss out on a bit of the kind of personal sense of how are you going to fit within this organization. What's the general kind of work culture like? But this allows these companies to kind of cast a much wider net in terms of who they're interviewing, because flying people out is relatively expensive. And it also provides a lot more flexibility in the sense that instead of having, you could still imagine you're going to have whatever it is, 6 hours, 8 hours of interviews. This might let you split it over 2 days, which, it's questionable whether that's a benefit for you or a benefit for your interviewers. But the takeaway here is that within most of tech, I don't see a return to the in-person flyout. Like maybe if you're already in San Francisco and all of the employees are already back in office, maybe they'll have you come on site. But I think by and large, if you're kind of applying first round, from all over the world, all over the country, whatever, I think you should expect that these things are still going to be online for quite a while. So industry on-sites can kind of wrap up a pretty wide variety of things. Some of these things will always exist. Some of them are going to vary by firm. So one thing that you might have is a general research presentation in the sense that you're presenting your academic research, right? Your job market paper to a group of your potential peers. So the thing that I'll say with this is that as you're thinking about how to structure this, you will need to pivot from the way that you build out an academic talk, right? Much in the same way that you shouldn't give the same talk to an econ department that you're going to give to a policy school, or let's imagine that you're a health economist and you might be interviewing it at a school of public health, right? You would have different talks and different ways to frame these things, right? You're going to need a different way to frame kind of the research on that. So in most cases, right, you're going to be talking to a pretty diverse audience, so not just economists. And so you kind of need to be able to not get lost in the weeds in the way that we would in an econ talk. And the things you want to be hitting on are you want to be showing kind of your general empirical abilities, your ability to synthesize things into kind of an understandable manner. So the way that I would always describe this is like, let's imagine that you're talking to a good MBA student, right? Somebody who's smart, who has perhaps seen things recently and things critically, but doesn't have the same background that you do about econ theory or econometrics, right? In your jobs, those are going to be the kind of people who you're going to have to be influencing as stakeholders, right? And that's very much something that they want to see out of your research, right? Can you synthesize this in a way that will matter to an executive? And kind of on that front, I want you to think critically about how you can frame whatever research it is that you have in kind of a more general or impact related sense, right? So, for better or for worse, right? What econ programs are doing is by and large policy related now. And so if you've written 3 essays on environmental economics of, offshore wind power, right? Google doesn't care about the results of offshore wind power, right? Google wants to see your ability to, to frame out the problem and, oh, I used stated preference methodology, right? How can that be applied somewhere else, right? So that's kind of what's going on with the research panel segment. There may all, depending on kind of where you're at in your career, this may also involve, like if you've already been in a position as an economist or a data scientist in a private sector company, this could be showing an existing project with the caveat, right? Don't get yourself sued for disclosing trade secrets. There's always going to be a manager interview. And so this is typically speaking going to be the person who would be your direct manager in the position you're hiring for. Some of the bigger firms like Google do more batch interviews where you pass the hiring bar and then you sort into a team, but there's still going to be kind of a hiring manager, somebody who's a step or 2 steps above the position that you're hiring at on the management chain. And so this will typically follow the pattern of the behavioral interviews, which I'll talk about next, but just keep it in mind that this is somebody who perhaps you need to have a little bit more focus on, right? So behavioral interviews are by and large going to be case studies. So I'll talk about kind of how to think about these in a little bit more depth in my next slides. But they're going to give you, if you were in a, let's imagine that you ran this experiment and you saw these results. How would you communicate that to an executive, right? Things like that. Coding interviews are, this is live. You open a tab that's got a Python instance or an RStudio instance or whatever, and they ask you to implement an algorithm. Like the coding interviews are relatively stressful in my experience. There are some things that you can do to prepare for them in terms of just being used to the graphical interfaces. But yeah, the coding interviews can be pretty stressful. The questions that they're asking are usually not going to be super sophisticated things, but they want to see your ability to think quickly, especially algorithmically, about how to approach problems. Technical interviews, this is often just like people throwing stats questions at you, right? So this could take the form of asking a question about if you're sure that one of the coefficients in your model is 0 and you have theoretical reasons for it, right? Should you include that in your model or should you not include that in your model? And then you should say things about kind of, oh, it's going to affect the standard errors, right? They can also be kind of within case specific, where how would you build out to understand the sample size requirements. But this is where kind of your focus on your specific math is gonna really need to come through. And then finally, there's a bar raiser in a lot of the big companies, and this is if the companies don't have, like, if you are hiring to a specific to a specific team, the bar raiser is going to be somebody who's senior from another team, just to kind of make sure that, are you up to snuff for the firm writ large, right? So in terms of technical interviews, right, these are compounding things where they'll ask question and you keep making the question harder and harder until you hit a wall on it, right? They're collaborative. You can bounce ideas off. You can iterate through. The real thing that they want to see here is your ability to think through a problem and structure it out, right? Lay out your assumptions, ask clarifying questions, and be clear about how you would find an answer to the problem, right? I had a candidate who who we ended up hiring, and I asked her something, and she's just like, "Yeah, I don't know that off the top of my head. Here's how I would go about finding it." And that was a fine thing for me, right? Just fair warning in tech, you know, these are going to be heavy on probability theory and combinatorics. For whatever reason, people love asking about sample size calculations. So behavioral interviews, as I mentioned, are, you know, how do you think through a problem, right? There's no right or wrong methodology, but you need to be showing your thought process, right? So much as in, you know, if you're TA in a class, or if you're teaching a class, you can't give partial credit if people don't show their work. Here, you need to show your work, right? You need to walk through what you're thinking about, and again, be able to explain to a non-economist what you're doing. So every interview is going to have a few minutes at the end, 5-10 minutes, where you get to ask them questions, right? This is a two-sided matching problem. So it is absolutely valid for you to look for red flags about them and figure out if they are going to be a bad company for you. There's a lot less information about specific companies, especially as you get smaller. Like we can all look around and see like, oh, here are the other faculty at, you know, UMass Amherst, and figure out what they are. Especially in smaller tech companies, you won't have that ability. So, you know, this is where you can kind of search for things that are red flags in general or red flags for you, right? So if you have strong idiosyncratic preferences about location, you know, this is where you can understand like, oh, like, are you guys really going back to the office? Where's that going to go? On-call schedule. This is, so on call in tech, right, is more of a developer issue, where, you know, if something breaks on Amazon.com at 2 o'clock in the morning, who's going to fix it? There's some data scientist roles where you have on calls, and if that's going to be a deal breaker for you, you know, figure it out. Those are pretty uncommon. I think it's pretty valid, especially kind of where the tech market is right now, to ask about market conditions. You know, you don't want to take a job and then get laid off in 3 months. So figuring out kind of, is this a prioritized area in the firm? With startups in particular, you know, you can ask if they're profitable or not. They may not be able to tell you because of, you know, depending on where they are in kind of a launch phase, but you can absolutely ask that and get a sense of it. And those are important questions to ask. And then finally, just like the previous speakers were saying, you know, or John in particular, you know, get a sense of what the job actually is, right? So figure out what they're doing on the day-to-day. I like this question, especially if you're talking to another, you know, economist or PhD, about, you know, what are the things that you're working on that are kind of exciting you methodologically, right? So if you know, continuing to push from you know, to continuing to push yourselves on the methods, right? If that's something that's interesting and important to you, right? This is where you can kind of figure out, are people actually, you know, are people continuing to discover new methods and, you know, write papers about it, whatever, or is this kind of a business intelligence kind of thing where you're dashboarding and doing a lot of executive interfacing? Either of those are fine, but this is where you kind of get to figure out what is the actual job going to be entailing on the day-to-day. So that's what I have in terms of slides. So I will go ahead and turn it over to JP.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And last but certainly not least, we have JB Doyle from Cornerstone.
All right, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I had to switch my audio in the middle. Okay, 1 second. Let me pull up my slides. Okay. And hopefully you can see that now. Is that good?
Yep, great.
All right, awesome, cool. All right, hello everybody. It's great to be here talking to you. Looking forward to it. I'm here from Cornerstone Research, where I'm a principal in the Boston office, and to kind of provide you with a little bit of a different perspective in the private sector. So we're an economic and financial litigation consulting firm. I've been here about 10 years. Got my started right after I got my PhD in economics in 2012. And during that time, I've also been pretty significantly involved in the centralized associate recruiting process. So for us, associates that's the position we hire new PhDs into. So, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the firm, because it's a little bit different and not everybody knows that much about it. So what we work on is complex economic and financial issues that come up in litigation or regulation. So kind of the classic example on the econ side would be, say, one company wants to buy another and there's an antitrust concern from the government. We'll come in and look at that and analyze the market and kind of sort of think about what the impact would be and help inform the decision that will be made there about whether to approve the merger. That's not an area that I've personally worked on. And I've actually worked a lot on the finance side. I was doing macro and financial econometrics in grad school. So I've done a lot of work in looking at the impact of algorithmic and high frequency trading on markets. So it's kind of been a pretty hot area for us in the last 10 years since Flash Boys came out. And I've also done a lot of work more recently looking at the market impact of collusion among financial institutions. So this is LIBOR is the classic example, but there have been a ton of other, examples of that in the space, different allegations of big banks colluding for auctions for government securities, rates they're charging on short selling when you're borrowing securities to short sell, all kinds of stuff like that. So, what I would note kind of upfront here that I think is a little different from what John and Jonathan were talking about is that we are not hiring people into a particular function or a particular group or area. Some consulting firms do that, but we don't. So we're kind of hiring people to be generalists. You can work on all kinds of different things and kind of just depending on what you're interested in and so forth. So that's one thing that's a little bit different. So talking now a little bit about the recruiting process. So, which is also a little bit different, a lot of similarities to what others have said, but some differences. And I kind of want to go through that and how we look at candidates a little bit differently. So we have 2 rounds of interviews. First rounds are just 2 one-on-one interviews, usually virtual, but sometimes they'll be in person. Like if you're local to an office, we'll have you come in. One thing that's very different from what Jonathan was just saying is that we are actually back, partially in the office. So we're in a hybrid environment, and my guess is it's probably going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. And so what that means is that we're in the office 2 or 3 days a week and working from home or wherever remotely another 2 or 3 days a week. So that's, to say that, you will get hired into a particular location. And so in the first round, we will be kind of asking you about what locations you prefer. And we have offices in kind of all the major cities or a lot of the major cities around the US. So you kind of tell us where you want to be. And then that's also the time to bring up, and you don't have to provide any kind of details, but if you are engaged in a joint search with, say, a significant other or whoever, just helpful for us to keep that in mind in our planning process, because we might know, okay, you're likely to want to be in, say, New York or San Francisco, or wherever you tell us are the most likely places you'll want to end up, and we can kind of fly you out to one, but knowing that we might end up needing to transfer your offer later, and so that's usually not a problem. So that's kind of the one thing that's is very helpful to do in the first round. And then the second rounds, again, by and large, similar to what others have said, but maybe some little differences. So I'll list kind of in order of importance from how we're evaluating candidates. First is we have a series of one-on-one interviews. At Cornerstone, it's 5. There is a presentation of your paper, and then we'll take you out to lunch. So maybe a little less than academia. There's no dinner the night before. There's no breakfast the morning of. Different from what Jonathan was saying, because we actually do bring you into the office and so on. So let me go through each of those. But before I do, I kind of want to just start with like, what are the big picture things that we are looking for? And that will sort of, I think, help set the context for, you know, how you should and how we approach the different sort of phases of the flyout. So first of all, which is kind of going to be, you know, pretty consistent across all the places that you're looking, given where you're coming from, we're looking for people who have strong applied research skills. The only thing I would say that's a little different maybe from some other places is that we are, you know, people are coming to us. So attorneys and their clients are coming to us and asking us to look at questions that are important to a case or you know, a regulatory investigation that they're involved with. So the questions are coming to us, and we get a lot of really interesting data that you can't get publicly from them to look at those questions. But generally, you know, we don't have the luxury of kind of picking out, oh, this is a setting that's like really ideal to do this experiment. You know, like in tech, we can't really run experiments. So we kind of just have to work with maybe a little bit of a messier situation where not everything's perfect, and figure out how, you know, you can kind of still approach that in the best possible way to figure out what the evidence shows, et cetera. So the interviews are kind of geared towards dealing with these messy real world situations a little bit more. So I'll talk about that in a minute. The second thing is we are heavily team-based, and everything you do at Cornerstone or in any litigation consulting firm is going to be with a team. So you're never going to be kind of having your own sort of research project that you're doing, where maybe you have co-authors that you're sort of periodically interacting with or passing the ball on a project. It's like you're really working actively with people kind of all the time on you know, maybe the 2 or 3 teams that you're working on in any given day. So we're looking for people who are kind of energized by that, who, you know, are really want to be in an environment and would thrive in an environment where you're actively working with, kind of learning from and teaching others kind of as you go. So that's number 2. And number 3 is, this isn't really different from other places. We are looking for people with strong communication skills, but exactly what we're looking for, I think, is a little bit different, although it's pretty similar, I think, in some ways to what Jonathan was saying. We are looking for people who really can take something that's a complex kind of research project and the results from that, and communicate that in a way that's intuitive and accessible to a broader audience. And that's because, you know, while we are mostly like PhDs working together, and we are often working in support of a professor who will be the one testifying in court, so everybody kind of speaks the same language there. But the people that ultimately are the audience for this are, you know, the judges and the juries, and they are not usually PhD economists, almost never. So, you know, they're very smart, but we need to be able to communicate in a way that's intuitive and accessible for people who don't speak that same language and don't have that same training. So that's something that we're looking for, you know, somebody who can really like think intuitively and present their research that way. All right, so with that kind of framing in mind, I'll go through each of the pieces and kind of talk about how, you know, I think it makes sense to think about them. So starting with the one-on-one interviews, the one-on-one interviews is the most important thing for us. You know, it's probably flipped from academia, where the presentation and the paper is the most important thing. For us, it's the interviews. For us, I said this might be a little different for different firms. We have 5 interviews for the flyouts. They're all structured exactly the same way, and they're the same way in the flyout as they are in the first round. So they're 45 minutes, and they're all in 2 parts. The first half is behavioral, and those are kind of, behavioral means, it's kind of a loose term, but it means for us questions about you, your experience, your research. And the second half is a case discussion. So that's going to be totally different, I think, from what a lot of people have been, from what others have been describing, although it's pretty standard in consulting. We are going to tell you about a project, kind of a simplified version of a project we worked on, and just ask you how you would approach that from a research perspective. So you'll get that, you know, in all of your interviews. People talk about who you're likely to meet with. So you will meet with a range of people. They're going to be from, they're mostly going to be PhDs, but they'll be from a range of different fields. You will almost always meet with someone very senior. So if you come into Boston, there's a good chance you're going to interview with the president of the company who happens to be here. Or if not, then the head of the office. So you'll always meet with someone very senior. And bunch of people in the middle, but you will also should expect you might end up interviewing with an analyst as well. So for us, analysts are people who just have undergrad degrees. So, analysts are obviously part of any team that we're on. And so the idea is we want to see people who are effectively engaging with all the different types of people that you would be on a team with. All right, so talking through those different pieces, the first piece is the behavioral portion. So that's always going to start with like an elevator pitch of your paper or your research. I'm sure that's something you're all polishing already, so that's really important. And then you'll get a mix of behavioral questions. Jonathan just talked about this a little bit, but for us, it means kind of like the whys of what you've done. Why did you get a PhD? Why are you interested in consulting, et cetera? And what we're really looking for here is a couple of things, I would say. So at least for me, the way I think about this. So first, I'm looking for somebody who comes across as genuine, is not just sort of totally scripted. So there is kind of a fine line here. You want to prepare, but you don't want to, over prepare. You want to make sure you come across as genuine, because it's kind of going to, it's going to that trust element, I think, and that you can kind of feel like this is someone that would work well on a team. And the second piece is we want people who have that entrepreneurial mindset, who kind of can demonstrate that they've been very intentional and had a purpose behind the decisions that they've made through their career. And that's the kind of attitude I think that's really valuable in consulting. And then you also have a couple of, you'll get questions that are very specific to like the skills that are relevant for the job. So, think about examples when you worked on teams, when you collaborated with other people and so on. Also teaching is important, because kind of, as I was saying, in some ways our role at some level is, at least a part of it, is to kind of educate the court about, here are, the relevant economic concepts in this situation, and here's how they apply. All right, so the second part, which is probably going to feel like a little unfamiliar and a little nerve-wracking, I guess, sort of like what Jonathan was saying with the coding kind of interviews, but it's, so again, we will describe to you a simplified version of a project, usually something that we've actually worked on, and just ask you how you would approach it. So unlike what Jonathan was saying, it's not technical at all. There's not going to be any sort of math or actual, like, solving anything on the spot. It's more just kind of being able to grasp the important economic considerations in a new situation, and figuring out what are going to be the major challenges from an applied perspective in answering the research question, with whether it's selection issues, whether it's likely unobservables, et cetera, things like that, and thinking about, well, what would be the best approaches, or what would be some approaches that you could try to take there, and then it can kind of flow into a discussion from there. But again, that goes back to what I was saying about, we're looking for people who can kind of get comfortable with dealing with messy situations that come up in these real world applications. All right, then, so that's the first part. That's these one-on-one interviews. And then you have the job market presentation. Again, I guess what I would say here is kind of echoing what Jonathan said. You do want to tailor this a bit to consulting. The key is, first of all, it's going to be shorter. So we do 1 hour presentations, and the audience will be kind of broad. So the audience will, for example, include analysts who, again, don't have PhDs. And so what we're really looking for you to do here is to focus on kind of the higher level, like, why was this an important question? Why did you look into this? what were the major challenges that you faced, and kind of what did you find? And being able to really tell that story in an intuitive way that's accessible to, you know, a broad audience that will, you know, not necessarily have PhDs, is really the key. So when you're looking to shorten your presentation by 30 minutes, think about taking out, you know, if you have proofs in there, that's not really what we're focused on. Robustness checks usually can be summarized. We're really looking for you to just kind of tell that compelling narrative, and then you can have things in the appendix where if questions come up, you can flip to them. And also I would just say, like, expect questions from all kinds of people. So it's really common and we encourage it. It's kind of part of our culture for analysts to ask questions during the presentations. So you should expect that. And part of what we are looking for is that you're able to effectively listen to and respond to questions from people who, you know, don't have PhDs and maybe didn't like fully have the background to understand exactly, you know, the underlying logic of what you were saying. And so being able to take that step back and really say, okay, here's what's going on and here's why this makes sense here. That's a major thing that we're looking for. All right, and then there's a lunch. So the lunch is like, we're not really evaluating you on the lunch. It's really more, you're gonna go out to lunch with a couple of consultants. They're people that, you know, will likely have PhDs, but they won't be analysts. They'll be, you know, more senior than that. So either recent PhDs or more senior than that. And this is really just kind of like an opportunity for you to just kind of get to know us, like really get a sense of what are the people like that you'd be working with, and what are all the, you know, answers to the questions that you might have about the job. So, you know, you might have a few minutes in the one-on-one interviews. People try to leave a little time for you to ask questions, but it tends to be very limited. This is really like the time to ask all your questions. So, you know, things that I would encourage you to bring up are, which both John and Jonathan already said, which is what is kind of it actually like on a day-to-day. So you'll hear these cases in the interviews. It's kind of a stylized example or a simplified example of something, some project that somebody worked on, but you won't really know from that, like, what did that person actually do? Like, how did the, you know, what were the different people on the team and how did they approach this? This is kind of a great, you know, opportunity to get a better sense of that. You can ask the people, like, what are you working on now? And like, what's your role in this project? It's also a great chance to ask about kind of the challenges that those people faced, you know, things they found hard about transitioning to consulting and things that they sort of, you know, view as not their favorite parts of the job. Totally appropriate to ask about that during this time. You know, I think it's you should, honestly. I think it makes sense. So I would really encourage that. I think the only mistake you can really make in the lunch is just kind of not engaging. So I would just encourage you to really use this opportunity to learn about the firm and kind of get a sense of whether it's right for you. And then last, you know, kind of some tips, like what can you be doing now to prepare for this? So first of all, and others have mentioned this, you know, something similar as well. You should look at the firm's website that you're going to, and just, it doesn't take, you don't have to spend a lot of time on it. For us, you know, just go to the website, spend 20, 30 minutes. You can see like, you know, pretty detailed descriptions of what all the different areas are that we're working on. You can see write-ups of recent cases that we worked on, and just get a better sense of like what we're actually doing. And I think that will really help you with context coming into the interview. And also, I'm sure it'll give you ideas for questions to bring up. So you should definitely do that. You should also work on, which I've kind of already said, but you should work on like practicing communicating your research in a concise and intuitive way that's going to be accessible to a broader audience. So you have, you know, that 1 hour version of your job talk. You'll want to work on your elevator pitches for your research and your statement. And then I think it's really helpful to practice talking about your research with people who are not in your field, and also people who are not economists, because I think that kind of can really help figure out, oh, what's intuitive to a broader audience and what's not. So I think that's very helpful, and I would encourage that. And then you should think about like what you would say to these behavioral questions that I was mentioning, like, why are you interested in consulting? Like, why did you do a PhD, et cetera? I think that's something you can do, and it's not hard. And, you know, so you can come in and not be put on the spot for that. And then again, you should think about like, what do you want to know more about the job? And so when you come into that lunch, you can engage and really use that time as effectively as possible. So I think that's what I had to cover. And I think we're headed into Q&A now. So happy to answer any more questions that you all might have.
Thanks so much, JB, and everybody else who presented. So we'll transition to the Q&A now, indeed. So there's a couple of ways you can ask your questions. You can raise your hand via Zoom. You can type your question into the chat, or you can message it directly to me if for some reason you don't want other people seeing your question. We'll prioritize questions related to flyouts, but because this is, the last virtual workshop, we'll also take any other questions you might have about the upcoming job market. Except for maybe offers, we'll defer those to the next session. So please, if you've got a question, go ahead and ask.
Hi.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Sulagna. I'm a fifth year student in the U Chicago. Thanks everyone for your great presentation. So I had a question for Anne about so you spoke about about interviews during the flyouts. So is it true that only your job market paper matters for these discussions and flyouts, or I should give some weightage in my preparation to my other papers as well and stuff like that? Because I've heard conflicting advice about this, whether only your job market paper matters or you should equally devote time to others as well. So that's why I thought I would ask. Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So so as far as I can actually give you two parts of advice. Okay, so when I was interviewing at ASSA, I was like, I need to put a lot of stuff on my CV so that I look awesome, right? And so, some people, you're going to get the range. Some people are just printing off your CV and then rolling into the interview with no preparation. Some people are going to be, I had somebody who literally was highlighting footnotes and then asking me questions about footnotes. Okay, so you can't prepare, you can't make any assumptions here. It's going to vary a lot, probably by individual characteristics, not even by institution. So if something is on your CV, then that is fair game. So in my situation, I had a paper, and actually it's been published, it's not like a fake paper, it's been published since, but I hadn't thought about that in probably 6 months. And that was a little bit much. So then, you have to, I didn't go further, but who knows if that's the reason, but you have to, yes, anything on your CV is fair game to ask about. At the flyout stage, I think you're going to get very few questions before your job talk about your job market paper, because they are expecting to see that later, and any question will be answered then. People before your job talk will if it's a research question, they're going to ask you about your pipeline. Most people are going to ask questions about your job talk during your job talk. Okay, that's the forum for that. People might ask follow-up questions or things after you do your presentation. That can happen, but oftentimes it's be prepared to be talking about your pipeline, especially. So for me, I do experiments, and actually one thing that came through in a lot of my interviews is, are you going to be able to do anything when you're here, right? Especially you can't go off and go to Uganda and live there for a year like you just did. So you want to demonstrate that you will be productive, especially if you have a type of research that has a high fixed cost, or you have proprietary data that you might not be able to get again. You want to be able to convey that you will be productive. So I would be prepared to talk in detail about at least one other paper or two when somebody asks the general question, what else? What are you going to do here? Things like that.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you so much.
We've got a question in the chat. I'm a little confused about the job market spiel versus the flyout presentation. Do we need slides for the initial online interviews, or is it much less formal?
For academic, it's going to vary. Some people will say, please prepare slides. If it's an in-person or an in-person, and we might do an in-person. We're not hiring this year, but I can see in the future we do in person. It would definitely never have slides. Otherwise, people just want to hear you talk briefly about your research. So it's going to vary. They'll tell you, and you can ask.
Consulting, yeah, you can definitely ask. I agree. For consulting, definitely no slides in the first round.
Yeah, I think so. For government also, I think when we done virtual, it's always pretty similar to the standard structure for a first round interview, which is, tell us about your job talk, but no slides or anything like that. It's not that it's less formal, it's just that it's less of a presentation you're giving to someone and more of an interview.
Yeah, I'll just add from myself also, because during initial interviews, you're so frequently interrupted. I'm guessing most places will not, the vast majority of places will not expect you to have slides, because it's supposed to be more of a conversation rather than a presentation. And the spiel might be very short. You might not get to say very much before you're interrupted. Okay, so we've got a bunch of questions for JB in my chat. I will ask, I'll ask one at a time. Okay, for the associate position at Cornerstone, do you prefer an academic CV, several pages, or a one-page industry style resume?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. There's no need to do something different for us. The academic CV is totally fine. It doesn't need to be one page. Most people submit an academic CV, and that's what I would encourage you to do. It's not necessary to create like something that fits on one page, like you kind of traditionally heard about for maybe like management consulting and so on. So no need.
Okay. Second question, you may have mentioned a case discussion in the flyout interviews. Do first round interviews also have a case discussion? Is the case solving in the first round interviews going to be technical?
So yes, all of the interviews, so you'll have 2 interviews in the first round. Well, for Cornerstone, at least, the numbers might be a little different places. You'll have 2 in the first round, 5 in the second round. They all have cases. They're all like structured exactly the same way. The first round is not more technical than the second round. It's all the same. It's just, here's a, setting, a project that I worked on, a simplified version of it. How would you approach this from a research perspective? Like, what do you view as the major challenges, and what are the tools that you would use to try to address those?
Okay. Next
Sorry,
question.
I'm dealing with light.
Oh, yeah, that's better. Okay, could you also, for JB, could you give us a sense of the number of new grad PhD students who are hired each year?
Yeah, it's that's a good question. It's a difference, I think, from other places that have been sort of brought up. Probably ballpark. I don't even know the number actually for what we're targeting this year, but we're definitely hiring. Probably ballpark like 50.
50?
So yeah, across all of our offices, that's like around what it's been for a few years. And so, generally, like some of the implications that has, which is a little different from some of the, things that others have said, is that, we don't like fly 3 people out and then wait to see them all and then decide. We make decisions after we see every person. So, we bring someone in, we try to talk like that day or soon after that, and then we try to get back to you, within a week. So it's kind of all on a rolling basis for us. So that's something that I forgot to mention.
That's great, because that was actually related to the 4th question about the hiring timeline. And the follow-up to that is, how long do you give candidates to decide whether to accept an offer or not?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. And actually, like there is like some strategy that changes every year a little bit, and it's different across different offices. So it can be a little different. I mean, basically, we see people before, we have people fly out before the AEA, ASSA meetings. And we usually would give a deadline that's like out into January that gives you time to like have flyouts and consider other options. We're not a place that, and this can be different across different firms, we're not a place that wants to put pressure on you to make a decision quickly before you see, you know, the other options you're going to have, because we don't want somebody to like make a decision they regret. So like for us, we might give you a few weeks. Can be different depending on the circumstances, depending on whether you come in after the ASSA or before. And there's kind of like no, you may, and it's not guaranteed, but you may be able to sort of, you're getting close to that deadline and say, hey, I need a little more time. I've got these flyouts. I really want to see it. That's something that you should definitely like ask about. And you don't always, we can't always do it like if we're filling up, but in general, we don't try to put a lot of pressure on people timing wise. So that's at least the strategy of our firm.
Great. Final question for JB. Do you have a target school list when recruiting new PhD students?
Well, we have schools where we go on campus. Well, actually, I don't know if they did that this year or not. I think they might have still done virtual. Anyway, we have schools where we do like presentations of some kind of info session. And they're usually geared around the like major schools in the cities where we have offices. But now that things are virtual, we expanded that a little bit. So there is some sense in which we have kind of a target school, but we get applications from all over the place and we consider them all. So, you know, you can apply through our website, and it's not actually, we don't have a process like what Jonathan described for data science. We don't have like an algorithm. We're going to look at every CV we get. And there's going to be like a person that, a consultant that looks at that, you know, a PhD that looks at that and decides like, is this person a potential fit or not? So we get applications from all over the place.
Great. Okay, we have about 15 more minutes for more questions if people have them. Or we can wrap it up early. I think those presentations were incredibly comprehensive. We can also just wrap up now. Or is there a question?
I have one more question if nobody else has
Sure.
questions again for Anne. So you did mention about pipeline. If you could talk a little bit more about, you know, just in broad terms, like what kind of questions to expect in these day-long type interviews and stuff. Of course, it varies, I understand, but like just in case there are any broad themes. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I think the main thing that we would be, well, first of all, because some of these meetings, people are kind of searching for topics, right? I mean, 30 minutes can also sometimes be like a lot of time to fill. And so I think part of it is just making conversation, right? So it is also okay to ask people, tell me about your research, and kind of just keep the conversation going that way. I think you want to try to avoid awkwardness. As far as people who are specifically asking you about your research and your pipeline, what you want to convey is that you have a plan for after your job market paper, because any sort of university is going to require probably 4 to 6 papers published in the next 6 years to get tenure. We do not want to hire somebody that we can't tenure or that doesn't have the expectation of getting tenure. Some universities might hire people and just kind of more roll the dice. I feel like at lower ranked institutions outside the top 20, that's not a gamble we want to take. So in other words, we want to hear that you have a plan for what's going to happen next. And I think you should be prepared, varying degrees of detail about what that paper would look like. And I think for most schools also to graduate, you need 3 chapters, right? So it's okay to have a descriptive chapter. It's okay to have a plan or just an identification strategy and the data is cleaning. What you want to convey is that you are not a one-hit wonder. That's what I would say.
Okay.
I guess I'll ask kind of a general question to anybody who wants to answer. Are there certain questions that you should not ask during flyouts, but wait until you have an offer from a place? Like, are there any questions that you would advise people to refrain asking until it's, you know, offer negotiation time?
Yeah, I'll unmute and answer on that because I've got specifics in mind on that. Obviously anything relating to salary or benefits is an HR problem, and it's a very uncomfortable position to put the interviewer in. Like I had a situation in which we were hiring in a different country, and like part of the reason that companies like to hire in different countries is that it's cheaper, and they were asking about like relative salary differences between US and the geo that we were hiring in. So anything related to that, deeply avoid. As far as you've got your questions, they should be tailored to the person that you're talking to, right? There's going to be an HR conversation at some point where you can figure out, you know, all of these issues. Avoid that. I would, if you're targeting something that's outside of academia, and I would say especially with no hope of return, and I think government, there's some movement back and forth. I don't know about consulting, but like I accepted when I took the job at HP, like I'm done. Asking questions that signal that you're sad with that decision is hard, right? So like if you're going to a place that does not do publications, and like Google and Uber, they do publications, but most tech places, you're not going to be doing that. If you're asking a lot of questions around like the cutting edge research and publication, like that's going to look weird, and like you're not going to be happy there.
I'd also add exactly in the similar vein. So I was actually given advice like when I was applying to make sure you ask about course load releases and things like that. But behind the scenes, at a school where we have, you know, a relatively high teaching load, that indicates that you're not going to fit in. If your first instinct when you're talking with somebody is to say, how can I get out of doing part of my job? I think that can send the wrong signal at certain types of institutions. At certain institutions, that can send the signal, I want to apply for grant funding, and that can be good. But I wanted to flag that one because I was actually told to ask about that. And I don't know if that's a good advice for all places. I would also second salary, especially at a public institution. That indicates you didn't Google. Right. I think you should try to avoid questions that can be answered with Google in general. Yeah.
Yeah, like particularly.
Oh no, John,
We've got to get John a new internet connection.
Yeah. I think okay. Do you have anything else to add, Jonathan?
So the one thing that I would say is people will probably hit on this on the offers section, but just in case they don't, right? As Anne mentioned before, public schools in the US, those salaries are public information. You can usually track those down with like local newspapers will often have a database on their website. Government jobs, federal government jobs in the US, that's on the GS scale by and large, right? There are specific salaries that are tied to specific locations. Tech sector, levels.fyi is the place to be looking. There's a lot of kind of dev focus on that, but that would at least let you kind of level set about where you're looking. And I have no clue what where consulting goes.
Okay. John, are you back?
Yes, I am. Sorry. I hope you weren't waiting for this.
It's okay. No, we had another. Do you want to add anything about questions not to ask?
Just on the salary thing, I'll just underline that basically all public sector salaries are actually fully public, so you can actually just look up everyone's salary on your interview list.
Okay, I think John is having technical difficulties. So we'll take, there are some more questions for John, but given that he's having problems, are there other questions from the audience? Well, maybe we'll wait about 30 seconds to see if John comes back so we can ask him the questions. And if not, then I will encourage the person to maybe follow up with John a bit later offline.
I just want to maybe add a little bit of positivity that in general, the way that these interviews go is that people are excited to meet a potential colleague. People are generally interested in you. And I think the whole experience generally reflects that. And so I just want to convey that typically the environment, while you want to be, it's really hard to be on the whole day. Typically the environment and the interactions are more like, hey, how are you? I'm happy you're here. I took time out of my day to meet you. And actually, if people don't want to meet you, they don't have to. Everything is a choice, and people are going to be excited that you're there. And so just always keep that in mind, that that they want you to think good things about them too.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Okay, John, so there are 3 questions for you. I'm just going to read them all out loud and we'll see how many we can get through. Can you give a sense of the number of new grad PhD students hired each year? And then can you talk a little bit more about the timeline for the economist positions at a government agencies? And the third one is you recommended we do homework before flyouts on the related policy work in your own research field. Could you talk more about that? So let's see. Oh, John might be frozen. Okay.
Oh no.
Okay, that's okay. So unfortunately, sorry, I guess we won't get to those questions, but we do have another question in the chat. Are there any signs of quote unquote too much desperation that we should avoid showing?
In my mind, that would have to be such an extreme level of enthusiasm to work against you. That's typically not a concern, especially in locations that some people may have preferences to not be there. So I know, for example, I was told flat out that in a place that, so I'm from Ohio, in a place that is adjacent to there, but people may not want to live, and I express enthusiasm for being near there. That actually is the reason I got the flyout. Is that I express an interest in living in a place that some people may not want to. So I think if you have family in the area, if there is an actual reason why your preferences may differ from the standard preferences that others may assume, that there is no sense in not conveying that information directly. I think it would be hard because the people that live there and work there are proud of where they are. They want to have a colleague that wants to be there. They do not want to be filling your position in a year or two because you left. And I think that getting that across can be very powerful.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd tag on to that from, I was at USC on the faculty before I went to HP. if you do have these kind of idiosyncratic preferences, especially, I mean, I think you said you're from Chicago. There is a signaling game there where smaller, if you have idiosyncratic preferences for a small school, that's not typically recruiting Chicago people, there's a degree to which you have to convince them that you're interested, because they don't want to, like, they don't want to get jerked around by you and lose a line on a failed hire when you like end up going to Dartmouth, right? Like, so there, in terms of that signaling, if you've got these idiosyncratic preferences, that's very valuable at I think lower ranked schools. Let me know if I'm wrong, Anne.
I think that's totally cool. And also keep in mind that this is not a flat ordering. So for example, there was somebody from a very, very top ranked institution who told the committee that they really wanted to be in Boston for a dual body problem. That wasn't enough to convince them that they would come. And so therefore they didn't even get an interview. So I think that's another thing to consider, is that some people get top coded because we're not going to waste our time on somebody we don't think will come. So if you're in that situation where you want to be in some place that maybe it's not obvious that you would want to be there, I think you have nothing to lose by telling people all your business.
Great. John, are you back? Did you hear?
I am. Who knows how long this is going to last.
Did you hear any of those questions? How many PhD students do government agencies hire each year? Timeline of the position, and maybe a bit more about doing your homework before flyouts. But maybe let's just try to cover the first two. So the timeline a bit more, and how many PhD students get hired.
Yeah, I mean, so like government wide, it's probably in the low hundreds, I would say, across the entire federal government, including the Federal Reserve Board, which is the single largest employer of economists. Any given agency is probably looking to hire one economist. That's usually the modal search. That does mean that they're in a lot of the same situations that Anne and others have noted, where they have one shot, they need to hire someone. Having to wait for the next year is not good, particularly because federal government runs on a cockamamie annual budget cycle that occasionally can be quite unpredictable. So if you have funding for a vacancy, you want to fill it that year. In terms of timing, I would say a lot of it is going to depend on whether the agency is doing virtual or in-person flyouts. There's some extra bureaucracy on getting travel approved in the federal government that can add an extra week or two to the timeline between selecting the group of people that you want to fly out and actually being able to get them approved for travel and flying them out, which is not the case for virtual flyouts. So virtual flyouts, I would say, you're often going to be sort of 1 or 2 weeks after the initial interview doing the virtual flyout. For in-person flyouts, I would expect it to be sort of in the 3rd or 4th week of January on average. And then there's also a little bit of a delay often on the offer stage because of the government HR situation. Again, if you have a flat with a government agency, hopefully the hiring manager that talks to you will give you very detailed information on what exactly to expect there. And then, yeah, I know there were other questions.
I think we should stop here though, just to make sure we stick to our timeline. Thank you everybody for coming and for presenting and asking questions. We're going to take a half-hour break, and then we'll be back with a session on the offer stage.